Hello and welcome to This Week in Global Development. My name is Adva Saldinger and I'm your host today. And I am joined by two of my colleagues, Elissa Miolene, who's a global development reporter here at Devex and bringing you all the latest news and what's happening with USAID, and David Ainsworth, who's a business editor at Devex. Elissa, Dave, thanks for joining me. So why don't we dive in? I think in recent weeks we've been talking a lot about USAID, and it's partly because the sort of saga of the review and program terminations and what programs are up and running is still quite unclear. And I think this week we saw continued sort of demonstrations of that. Elissa, can you tell me a little bit about what we saw over the weekend with another wave of terminations coming from the Trump administration?
Definitely. So as you said, the chaos kind of continues on the USAID front. For a while now, we had assumed, and I think most organizations had assumed, that the review process was finally complete. We saw a list, which Devex reported on, being sent to Congress, and that list had active programs, terminated programs, and I think just the USAID document was some 281 pages. So it kind of seemed like things were set in stone. But over the weekend, and specifically on Friday, things started to change a little bit. So we started to hear reports that additional programs were being cut, including those that were focused on life-saving aid and food aid, which kind of from the get-go has been one of these pieces, which in theory was meant to not be touched, at least not touched to the full extent that we've seen. Regardless of that, we were sent an email from Peter Morocco, who leads the F Bureau, the Office of Foreign Assistance at State, talking about an executive order placed down by Trump, or rather an executive directive that wanted all foreign assistance to Afghanistan to be stopped. So he was kind of checking in. Have we done that? Have we done that? I'm fielding calls from the White House. We heard similar news about Yemen. So, kind of direction coming down from the White House about ending these awards that had previously been slated to survive. And then as the weekend continued, we were hearing...
To jump in quickly, do you
Yeah.
have any sense of why, Afghanistan and Yemen in particular were sort of targeted in this round of cuts?
So a little bit more clarity came out about that just Tuesday, which was that the State Department said it was for terrorism control, essentially. So looking at the Houthis and the Taliban and saying, there's kind of been claims for a long time that aid has been going to terrorist groups. And this was an attempt to mitigate that flow. Now, it gets very complicated as you dig into the weeds of that, but I believe that is why those two countries were targeted specifically.
Right. And just sort of following on from that, I think we heard after those cuts, then there was also a number of World Food programs and funding that was cut in this round of terminations. And as you said, one of the things that early on they said would be exempt from these cuts, or that received waivers, for example, to continue operating, was life-saving assistance and humanitarian aid, including food assistance, right? So what did we see at WFP? I know they came out with some pretty strong statements about the potential loss of life as a result of these funding cuts. And then we saw some of that get walked back too, right? So there's kind of this ongoing confusion. Can you fill us in a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So very strong words coming from WFP. The exact words were a death sentence for millions if this actually happens. And what they publicized on their social media account was that there were 14 programs that were slated to be cut. And you're right, by Monday, remember this started Friday, so it was like a flurry of activity over the weekend, but by Monday, we were sent an email from Jeremy Lewin, who is one of the now, head folks over at USAID. He's a deputy administrator, and he was saying, essentially, it was a mistake. So please walk back 6 of these terminations, and he listed them. They were in Syria, Lebanon, Ecuador, et cetera. Specifically World Food Programs, specifically emergency food assistance. So those were already kind of trying to be walked back earlier. And he even had an apology in that email. Sorry for all the back and forth. Again, that was confirmed by the State Department on Tuesday in a press conference with the spokesperson just saying, yes, we're not going to get into details, but there were some errors with World Food Program. Some of the organizations that I spoke to then were just like, okay, well, is my termination in error? Did this really mean to be cut, or is it going to, are we just, done now? Because remember, for many of these organizations, this is the second or third termination that they've received. So one organization that I spoke to that provides really kind of sounding like critical assistance for folks that lose limbs in explosives or bombings in Syria, and specifically in the northeast part of the country. They had been canceled, reinstated, canceled. So you're getting kind of this flip flop, and I think people are just exhausted.
Yeah, and I think this also points to potential challenge with some of the data that came out, right? We had this, data that was submitted to Congress about programs that were terminated or things that were kept, and then we see additional rounds of terminations. And Dave, I know you work really closely with all of our data reporters and trying to dive into some of this. And I know that you've discovered also that there are sort of challenges, and we don't know necessarily that this data is completely accurate. And in fact, I think you're hearing in some cases that it's not, right?
I think we know for a fact that it's not completely accurate. The question that we have to ask is how inaccurate actually is it? So we had one organization get in touch with us and say, essentially, all of the data about us is wrong. Our largest award has not, in fact, been cancelled. That's somewhere in the region of $200 million. The number of awards that have been cancelled is wrong. The number that have been kept is wrong. Everything about it is wrong. And we're now in the process, I think, of going out to all the other major agencies that we've written about and saying to them, I would understand why some of them might want to say we're not going on the record and telling you exactly what's happening. Like, it doesn't seem like a good time to be picking a fight with the government if you're a big aid agency right now. But we're asking them, is the information about you actually right? Because we just don't. We've had a couple of reports now from people saying that the report that was sent to Congress completely doesn't accurately describe our situation. And when we started to look at the State Department data, our colleague Raquel, who has analysed this in huge detail, essentially wrote a long article saying we can't really take anything from this. Like, there's so many awards. There's almost 100 awards that are listed as both terminated and active. We don't know the status of them. We just can't trust this. Like, there's so many mistakes in this that we cannot make a meaningful analysis of what this really means. So it's very hard to really trust this. I think we can trust the broad sweep of it. Like, and kind of, if we look at the average numbers across all of these thousands of awards, we've probably got a pretty good idea. But yeah, certainly
The specifics are definitely in
very
question.
questionable.
Or, I mean, I think part of what we've seen is that maybe it's changing and it's unclear exactly who's calling all these shots and who's determining that, this should be kept or this should be cut, or, and that there's even internal confusion, which I think is sort of illustrated by some of these issues this week around the WFP funding. But Alyssa, I wanted to turn to you because I think there are, we've talked about this in previous episodes about sort of what's next, right? Because I think, the review was slated to be 90 days, but they've said it's over. But then we're kind of continuing to see tweaks and changes. So what do you think about where we stand and sort of what Congress's role is at this point and all of that?
It's an excellent question. I think, I kind of tried to go through the State Department briefing yesterday with a fine-tooth comb, or sorry, rather on Tuesday with a fine-tooth comb. And, there was a question that was posed about, okay, we thought that the review is over. Has Secretary of State Marco Rubio been involved? He said he was involved. What's going on? And kind of the response was something like, we know the review has officially ended. I'm going to get more details into how, quote, the nature of how essentially those cancellations were transpiring. So it seems like there's a lot of information that's missing. There's information that I think even from the State Department side seems to not be clearly communicated, just based on what that spokesperson said on Tuesday. And she ultimately said, my goal is to get a fuller view now for you as these questions continue to come. So all of that to be said, we don't fully know. I think that we thought that everything was finished. We're also hearing some frustration on Capitol Hill from folks that we know, through our reporting saying, well, what is this list then? What are we supposed to use as lawmakers if this list is not accurate and complete? And like Dave said, if 100 or however many of the awards are actually on both active and terminated lists. And I think that frustration seems to be growing, at least from the folks that we're talking to as we're doing our reporting. In terms of just kind of, okay, what's in the pipeline? The State Department does continue to have these listening sessions, which we've attended, or at least gotten readouts for the ones that we cannot attend. As Adva, because you listened to one just this week. But there does seem to be just kind of continued conversation, continued dialogue about what is the United States' role in foreign assistance, what should it be, and maybe I can hand it back to you to talk more about what you heard this week.
No, I mean the listening session that I listened into this week was number of constitutional scholars talking about the constitutionality of foreign aid. And so that is, it seemed clear to me in that discussion that the administration was trying to understand how much power they have versus Congress and what the various interpretations of the Constitution could be that would lead to them having, or actually the president having, more direct control over foreign aid funding, and that his control could potentially supersede congressional directives. So that is an issue that I think is currently and will continue to be adjudicated through many of these lawsuits that we've seen pending. And it is a fundamental question. We've seen from this administration that they want to sort of challenge this idea, or the Impoundment Act, that says that, the administration needs to spend money as appropriated by Congress. So I think that is also could be and will be likely a very big point of tension with folks on Capitol Hill, particularly appropriators, that we haven't necessarily heard a lot from Republican appropriators with concerns about this to date. I did also cover a hearing this week on PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is the massive, global HIV/AIDS program that the U.S. has run since 2003. It was created by George Bush. Really successful, saved 25 million lives. And I think what was interesting about this hearing is that it was an appropriations subcommittee hearing. And, both the chair of the subcommittee and the ranking member, they actually agreed on a lot. And so I think there were inklings of still some bipartisan support for PEPFAR. I think there are concerns about, the chairman, Representative Diaz-Balart, said, the Biden administration took it down a wrong path, and he had warned repeatedly that if they would use it to sort of promote what he considered a, radical agenda, then it would undermine the program's support on Capitol Hill, and we have seen that happen. But a big part of the discussion was really about what's next. So I think the questions that he was asking and sort of framing the hearing is, PEPFAR was never designed to be forever. So how do you look at the future, and how do you figure out how to fund the sort of transfer of PEPFAR programs to local country governments? And so it was interesting because there was perhaps more bipartisanship than in some of the hearings that we've seen to date. But still some questions about exactly what funding levels might come through for PEPFAR, a lot of which has been considered emergency aid. But then again, also with PEPFAR programs, we've seen even programs on waivers that are continuing aren't getting funding or can't really start, or pieces of the supply chain are broken. So maybe they have the medications or the tests, but the program that was actually responsible for taking the test to the lab to be processed is cut. So, and that really undermines things. And we've seen, and including the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, they said that with, 50% of their programs are seeing impacts. They had a couple major programs that had been under waivers that were terminated. So that amounts to something like 200,000 people who were receiving antiretroviral medications that now aren't receiving that, including thousands of mothers and children. And so, you're still seeing a lot of this confusion, things that were supposed to be kept or at one point were being reversed, and the real significant challenges there. And then also conversations about, particularly in the HIV/AIDS space, if you don't look at prevention, which the programs that fell under the waiver were largely for treatment and care, you're not going to end the disease, right? You can't get to epidemic control if you're not preventing new cases from starting. So, we'll see where things go if Congress weighs in on what types of things it wants PEPFAR to do in the future. But I think that will be an interesting conversation to see as well. Dave, I wanted to turn to you because, we have been focused a lot on USAID, but we're also seeing unfolding conversations in Europe around foreign aid and how the EU is sort of looking at foreign aid. I think everyone's wondering, will countries in Europe step up to fill some of the US gaps? We've seen cuts in many European countries. So I think there's a lot of confusion. Can you tell me a little bit about what we reported on this week?
Yeah, so there's a few different trends here. I mean, we are seeing cuts in Europe. European governments are obviously thinking we need to spend a lot more on defense. A lot of governments are kind of thinking maybe we'll have to take some of that defense money from the aid budget. Certainly that's what's happened in my own country, the United Kingdom. We're seeing an interesting tussle in Germany between the coalition partners who are likely to form a government together. One of them is much more pro-aid than the other one, and one of the things that's on the table in that coalition discussion is whether they stick with the 0.7 target in Germany, which is now probably, we haven't seen the data yet, but probably is now the world's largest donor. We've seen a few cuts in France, probably not as, I think the reports have been a little bit overdone on the total French ODA cuts. We're seeing reports of 35% cut, but that's only in one budget line, probably much lower. So that's kind of the background there. But the new news emerging this week is that Europe has been looking at the specific areas where the US has cut funding, and outwardly they're saying we're not covering this. Like, we're not going to step in and cover what the United States has cut. But inside the EU itself, they are kind of talking to each other and saying, actually, if the US doesn't fund this is going to create a real mess for us. This is going to create real problems for Europe because it's going to have a direct impact on factors that are going to directly impact European security. And that's things like health, it's things like migration, it's things like humanitarian aid to fragile states. A lot of the world's biggest kind of problem areas are unfortunately quite close to Europe's doorstep. We're looking at Sudan, we're looking at Yemen, we're looking at what's happening in the Congo. A number of the kind of trouble spots are close enough to Europe, and then obviously there's Ukraine, which is in Europe, which is the biggest of the lot. And the Europeans are very much looking at that sort of stuff, taking a bit of an instrumentalist lens, thinking if we don't intervene here, these problems are going to end up on our doorstep. And you can understand why in public the EU is kind of reluctant to acknowledge that they're going to spend more if the United States spends less, because obviously that's sending a message to Donald Trump. We'll sweep up your problems for you, don't you worry, Donald. Like, you just spend less and we'll spend more. That sounds like music to the ears of the American president. So you can understand why that's not going to be the public position. But our colleague Vince has kind of looked behind the scenes and has found some evidence that those conversations are taking place in private. And I can't say I'm surprised, really. Like, it's problematic because we are in the short term looking at the European economies are in a lot of trouble due to energy crisis, the cost of refugees, the cost of war in Ukraine, knock-on effects of COVID, the fact that we're falling apart a bit as a rather than ever closer union. There's splits breaking out inside the EU. Look, a lot of economic problems, and they're very reluctant to spend money on aid. But I think there is also a growing recognition that we're going to have to. If we don't spend money on this stuff is going to end up being a problem for Europe. And we have seen a number of huge waves of immigration into Europe in recent times that have really upset the European population. And I think the EU and its constituent governments are very keen to put measures in place that prevent further migration. And I think that's kind of core to why they're thinking we're going to have to spend more money on this.
I think part of the question is, where does that money come from, right? As individual governments are cutting their official development assistance, is there more money there, or is it redirected from certain programs that they're funding today and they're going to have more of a focus on humanitarian aid? Because one of my understandings is actually that the US has sort of been the lead on humanitarian aid, which allowed a lot of European donors to focus on other issues, be it, more longer term development challenges, et cetera. So does that balance shift, and what loses out? Do we have any sense of that at this point, or that's still to be
I think
determined?
the discussions are very much ongoing at this stage. Like, there is, in theory, there's a lot of money in the EU budget because the EU has a 7-year budget, which has been fully allocated. So what that has meant in practice is that there have not been any aid cuts in the EU per se, because the EU budget has been set. It can't be changed. The countries have agreed the money that goes in there. Now, what they did do is they allocated some money away from poorer countries to tackle, I think, specifically migration and Ukraine. Now I'm speculating here. There's nothing in Vince's story about this particularly. This is me personally, Dave Ainsworth, having a guess, but there is the potential to transfer some money back to these kind of core areas from elsewhere in the EU budget. That would involve a lot of internal politics. It would be extremely difficult to do. You could see them just taking ages and ages and ages to get through this. But maybe European governments will start to have a rethink about this. This is somewhere where I really am very reluctant to get the crystal ball out to too great an extent, to be honest, because I feel like Europe right now is kind of having a kind of little bit of an existential angst, kind of trying to work out what its role is in the world. Like, Trump has really forced European leaders to kind of look at each other and go, who do we want to be? What is Europe? Are we all on the same side here? What are our real priorities? And there's been a lot of infighting and a lot of navel gazing in Europe. Basically, we've all hated each other for 1,000 years, and we're finding it very hard to kind of get over that fact and try and forget what somebody's great grandfather did to somebody else's great grandfather. And kind of America has had the extraordinary Donald Trump's America has had the extraordinary kind of effect of actually causing the Europeans to start liking each other a bit more, and kind of have a discussion about where we might want to go. I don't know what the outcomes are going to be of those government discussions. I don't think anybody does, including the leaders of Europe. But I wouldn't be totally surprised if we took a kind of long, hard look at each other and said, actually, we're just going to have to fix these problems. We need to deal with the security threats on it, because African instability, just like Russian instability, is a security threat to Europe. And as Volodymyr Zelensky said to Donald Trump, you've got a lovely great big ocean between you and these problems, and we don't. And I think we might have to wake up and realize we've got to address this stuff. And that's kind of what's there in this document that's in the story that Vince produced. That's one person, though, putting together one theory about how it might pan out. There are a lot of dissenting views in Europe. Certainly a lot of people as well who just want to throw up the barricades and say, we're not interested. We don't want to talk to anybody else. Like, you can't come in.
Yeah. Elissa, I wanted to turn back to you because one of the other pieces we published this week was a piece about U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And I know that I think we've been trying to understand sort of what his position is on foreign aid, because certainly his history would indicate that he believes in its value and has, in his time as a senator, introduced bills related to foreign aid, has been outspoken about issues including malaria and sort of the role of foreign aid in countering, Chinese economic development policies around the world. And I know that one of the things we also saw this week is that he went on a podcast and sort of spoke a little bit about foreign aid. And I was wondering if you could fill people in on sort of what he said and what we've sort of gleaned or can learn about where he stands on U.S. aid at this point.
Yeah, definitely. So he went on this podcast, which is called Triggered, and it's a podcast run by President Trump's son, also named Donald Trump. And basically what he said actually was a lot of what kind of similar to the threads that you were just speaking about before, Adva, which is his view is that foreign aid has been out of alignment with, foreign America's foreign affairs priorities. So he wanted to realign it. He spoke a lot about kind of the woke ideology that's being baked into aid and how this has been happening in years past. And I think there was on the Donald Trump Jr. side, like a comment about like a trans Elmo project. So, I mean, kind of get into the weeds there and how much you want to dive into that. But essentially what his overall point was that's ending. This kind of, as in his view, this liberal ideology being like baked and brought to various countries across the world. And what he wanted to push for is more of a security approach. So he mentioned like beefing up police departments so that countries would be able to better defend themselves from like gang violence, which is something that he's spoken about across Central America. And what that means in terms of like aid and security, I think, again, we're still trying to figure out, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is this like safer, stronger, more prosperous three-pillar principle that the Trump administration is kind of trying to, again, realign for what foreign assistance could and should mean. It was a really interesting kind of snippet of the conversation just focused on aid, because I think a lot of what Rubio said, again, just reiterated this shift in how he's approached and viewed aid over the last several years in terms of, kind of really walking back, one, on aid in general, but two, okay, walking back and then positioning in a different way and in a different light. So interesting conversation, lots of change.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that a lot of people are, I think I mentioned this earlier, is trying to figure out, what is, and you mentioned this as well, Elissa, what is Rubio directing and what pieces of this reorganization or realignment is being directed by the White House, by DOJ, the Department of Government Efficiency, et cetera. So I think that could also be leading to some of the confusion that we've seen over time. And obviously something that we'll continue to track and see how all this unfolds and see, I think one of the things that I think came up in the event that you hosted earlier this week, Elissa, is this question about, not really understanding like what is the, we've seen that they want a realignment, but what will they focus on moving forward? What is sort of the vision and strategy moving forward on foreign aid? If it's going to continue, what form will that take? What will be the priorities moving forward? And I think a lot of people want clarity on that, want to understand, what are the types of programs or initiatives that this administration is going to want to lean in on. So I think plenty of questions that we'll continue to explore in our reporting. I would like to thank you, Elissa and Dave, for joining me today, and all of our listeners. So give us a review if you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.